Hello, my name is Professor John Benjamin, and this is Graphic Design 1 at West Virginia Wesleyan College. Today we'll be taking a drawing that you've made previously, an abstract expressionist drawing, and we'll be using that in Photoshop to increase the contrast, make it darker or lighter, and do some touch-ups. And then we'll take that into InDesign to make a social justice. So German Expressionism began between 1910 and 1930. It's found in architecture and dance, painting, sculpture, and in film. Industrialization and World War II had a dehumanizing effect on Europe, and many artists distanced themselves from the traditional institutions, rejecting realism and the bourgeois society. And they wanted to express the subjective emotions of people, again, particularly sorrow. And woodcuts were often used so prints could be produced in large quantities. So here we have a really famous German expressionist, Kathy Kollwitz, and this is called Survivors. And this is about people that had survived, been displaced by the war. And you can see here in Kollwitz's work that this image, because of the way it's drawn, because of the way that the human faces are distorted in the woman in the center, it doesn't even have any eyes, that it becomes much more profound, much more emotional than, let's say, a real photograph could be. And same here with Emil Nolde's The Prophet. More so than a photograph or even a Renaissance painting, I feel like Jesus is tremendously sorrowful here, probably at the end during the crucifixion. Another Kathy Kollwitz is The Volunteers. Also, movement can enhance drama and line work. The Sacrifice by Kathy Kollwitz. Just the profound sadness that's depicted using this type of style of art. Old Man and the Noose. Munch, The Scream, and Two Men and a Table by Eric Heckel. So here's a drawing I did using somewhat of the German expressionist style of George Floyd. Police had his knee on his neck. I drew this with charcoal, and then I took a picture of it with my phone, and now we're going to touch it up somewhat. So the first thing that we want to do, and we bring it into Photoshop, is go into our layers. And we want to do non-destructive editing if we can, for the most part. So what I'm going to do, rather than start painting right over the top of this, I'm going to go ahead and create a fill or adjustment layer. And I'm going to use curves. So with curves, we have a histogram here that tells me the different quantities of blacks and whites throughout this piece. So I've got over here on this side, you can see there is quite a lot of blacks, but there's more sort of middle grays altogether. And then here's my whites. And so what I want to do is I want to increase the contrast between the two of them. So I'm going to bring my anchor point over this way and this way, and try to move them more closer together to really dramatically increase the darks. Like so. And this is what's referred to as an S-curve. And that's pretty close to what I want to have, so I'm going to leave that. And then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate the background. I'm just going to drag it down to the little plus sign here. And that way, in case I do want to make any changes, I still have this little backup layer here. I'm going to turn that off and select this layer. And now I'm going to go in with my, my burn and my dodge tools. So if I go in with my dodge tool, what I can do is what it does is it looks for pixels in a certain range, either midtones, highlights, or shadows. So for instance, I'm going to start with the midtones, exposure of about 50%. And you can see it's not affecting the darks, it's just lightening the pixels that are in the midtones. So I can get rid of that soft gradient area that I don't really want. Alright, and I'm going to go into the highlights, and I'm going to pull it out even more. But I want to darken up that line there. So now I'm going to change from my dodge tool to my burn tool. And this is a photographic process. So with my burn tool, the same thing. I can darken pixels that are in this range. So I'm going to start with shadows. And I'm really going to darken up all these pixels. and then maybe some of the midtones to increase contrast. I want it. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and hit save, and I'm going to move over to InDesign. And I've created an 11 by 17 poster here. And the first thing I'm going to do is set my grids and my margins. So I'm going to go up to here and say margins and columns. I want really wide margins here. I'm going to go as thick as 9 all around. All right, and then I'm going to create some guides. And the guides are going to be based on the margins. No gutter. So roughly the same width of the margins is what I'm looking for here. And the same with my columns. So I'm really dealing with a square grid. All right, so next I'm going to bring in my illustration. And I just dragged that in, by the way. You can also file place your image. Now it's quite large, so what I want to do is make it small without disappearing. So now remember, here in the Properties palette, if you select the black arrow or the selection tool, and if this reference point is in the center and I change it from 100% to 20%, it's going to go off of my board. See here it says the value will cause one or more objects to leave the pasteboard. So what I do in that case is I move the reference point to this top left position here. Now I can go ahead and say 20% reduction in size, and then it moves it to there. So that's a pretty handy tool. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and set up my illustration to where I want it. Crop in, I'd say right about there. And remember your W key so you can take a look at it. Now I want it to pop out of a dark background, so I'm going to go ahead and make a rectangle. Just going to click and drag out a rectangle. And then I need to come over to my Properties panel here and change the fill to black. And now I need to change the order. Remember, in your Layers palette, you can move the order of things. All right, so now I need to get my copy. All right, so here's the copy I'm using for this poster. All right, so right now, obviously I can't see it, so that doesn't do me any good. I want it to be white text. So I'm going to select it all and make a basic paragraph. First the color to white, then the character to Helvetica. All right, so there we have ungrouped text, and it's all white, and it's very difficult to decipher. So we're going to use chunking or grouping to separate this text out. So the first thing is I'm going to go ahead, make this title larger. This is my call to action, take action for human rights. Now I'm moving my text box all the way to the right, but I wanted to just go past this grid line here, because this is going to be an optical illusion. I want it to be aligned with this image. But because of the roundness of the S, a little optical illusion will occur, so it'll look centered even if it crosses that line a little bit. The next thing is I want to move this lower text away from my call to action. Well, your real call to action. This is what you're going to do if you want to take action for human rights. You're going to go visit actamnesty.org. So I want to separate that from this group here. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to make that a little smaller, and then I'm going to go ahead and increase probably about 2 picas. Alright, so we can see we've got some grouping, we've got some hierarchy now. And I'm going to add some branding to this. So this is an Amnesty International poster. So we're going to go ahead and bring in the logo. And I'm going to fit it to be right within the constraints of my grid. So to add a little more branding, I'm going to color the Amnesty yellow. And then my call to action, which is the website, I'm going to highlight that by coloring that yellow as well. All right, so what I want to do is I'm going to increase the size of this, moving over here to my height and width. I can increase it if I lock it together. And I want to zero in on, make the focal point the knee and the face, like so. Alright, and a few other things. I want to make this a little more contrasting. So if we want to go back to Photoshop, it's very simple. All you need to do is select the photo, right-click, and say Edit Original. And that'll automatically bring this up. Alright, so I want to add a little more contrast here. So I have my curves here, my adjustment layer. I just double click on the little grid here on the layer, and that'll bring this back up. Alright, I want to posterize it, make it much more contrasting. Alright, I think that's good. So I'm going to hit save, Command S, and then when I go back to InDesign, it should have automatically updated. And sometimes it doesn't, so we can go to our links palette, and there'll be a little warning sign that said it's been changed and you can update it. But typically it does it automatically. Alright, now I like what's happening here because one of the aspects that I find very disconcerting was the fact that George couldn't breathe, and it was very claustrophobic if you've ever been in a situation where you couldn't catch your breath. And the last thing I think I want to tinker with is I want to be mindful of my grid, so I want this text to move all the way to the grid line, so I'm going to make it a little larger. And this isn't really powerful enough, this take action for human rights. I need it to be bold and more condensed. So let's go ahead and do that. Right now it's 65 medium, but let's make it 75 bold condensed and make it a little larger. Check my grid, that looks right, and that looks balanced. And there's my poster, ready to make it into a PDF and print. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope to see you next time. Good luck with your poster.